Alright, so I want to apologize. At the end of the last video, we did a question about Dwarven rune crafting, and that was from Fat Ass Frodo. Just wanted to add that. So, sorry. Anyway, moving on. We've got Neb or something who asked, why are Dwarves... That's not correct. That's not the next question. Yes, the next question is Zach B. Sane who said... Okay, let's just start over. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dwarf Q&A series. I want to note that last episode we ended with a question, and I forgot to say it was from Fat Ass Frodo. So thank you, Fat Ass Frodo, for your question. I'm gonna get instantly demonetized for starting with that. Anyway, so our next question today comes from Zach B. Sane, welcome back, who says, "Are all dwarves super baby faced?" No, they are not. Crag the Grim would slap you for that. Neb or something asks, why are dwarves so beloved over their beards? Is there a cultural synopsis or myths/stories about them that give them their historical significance? And is it possible for a dwarf to ever be respected if they voluntarily shaved their beard? So no. A dwarf's beard is their most personal and prized possession. It symbolizes their age, primarily, and the length of a dwarf's beard is a strong signifier of the amount of respect they command from their peers, and also tends to directly correlate to their wealth. Nothing matters more to a dwarf than honoring their ancestors, and age is age is the most important thing a dwarf can have, followed by wealth. And of course honor is sort of thrown in there as a mix. And the thing about beards is, to dwarves, beards are a direct signifier of age. The way you tell a dwarf's age by just looking at him is the length of his beard. And so it is the most important, it's kind of the most obvious and important way for them to denote their significance in dwarven culture. And because dwarves' beards, in a physical sense, dwarven beards never stop growing until they die. So dwarves' beards don't get bald patches or stop growing or stunt at a certain age. Nope, dwarf beards just keep cruising until the end of time. So that's why it's such an easy and important way for them to tell. And so it's very important to take good care of your beard, because obviously if something happens to your beard, it could significantly affect your it just really looks bad in dwarven culture. So that's why dwarves who are really, really powerful or wealthy will have their beards super crazy interwoven and stuff. And it's also to make beards more manageable, because obviously if your beard keeps on eternally growing and you're 5'6", then eventually you're going to run into a problem with your beard scraping the ground. So what most dwarves will do is they will braid their beards with really intricate designs and gold and stuff to make their super duper long beards into more compact and easy to use forms. Of course, some dwarves just do really crazy loops. that's been seen before too. But to voluntarily shave your own beard would literally be seen as the highest form of insanity among dwarves. I honestly think to dwarves who view fratricide or patricide as just that blows their minds in a really bad way. I think they would put murdering your own kin below shaving your own beard as a form of insanity. If there was a Joker, from Batman for dwarves, he would shave his own beard. That would be the best way to denote himself. Back to Zach here, who asks, Zach must really like dwarves because he asks a lot of questions. Have any dwarves fallen to the worship of the four main chaos gods, not including Hashut, who is of course the god of chaos dwarves? So I would say no, but the correct answer is very, very, very few. So few, in fact, I can only name one. And the only dwarf I know of who, in their lore, canonically has fallen to one of the four powers is Grugni Ironheart, who was a dwarf that forged the Nurgle demon blade known as Blight Reaper, which is the focus of a Vermintide 2 DLC. Before him, I would have said no. That being said, I suppose it's, anything's possible in that kind of situation. But there are no, like, really famous ones, at least that I can think of. I would not be super surprised if there was a dwarf somewhere who had fallen to Khorne. Maybe they ended up in, like, a really bad place somewhere in the Chaos Wastes, or just something happened where they just completely lost themselves to rage or something like that. Because it's not impossible for dwarves to be corrupted. It's just really, really rare. But for a dwarf to, like, actively worship one of the 4 powers, the only one I know of is Grudge Ironheart. Which a dwarf worshipping Nurgle is, like, super funny because they're, like, direct opposites in a lot of ways. Anyway, Not Jake asks, can only men become beastmen after being mutated? Is there any history of elves, dwarves, or the like joining the beast herds or bray herds? Or do they not mutate in that way? Also, are there records of chaos mutating the greenskins? I know that they live just about everywhere, but it seems odd that there are never chaos warriors of greenskin chaos warriors. I think Khorne would love them. So, not technically a dwarf question, but we'll answer it anyway. Dwarves and elves are exceptionally gifted at resisting the physical mutations of chaos. It corrupts them in other ways, given enough time and, like, warpstone or corruption or emotional turmoil. So no, there are not any elven or dwarf-like beastmen anywhere in the world. They don't exist. It should be noted, however, that not only men can become beastmen. When the beastmen were created, a lot of them were men who became beasts, but in many times there are also animals who are corrupted or warped into beastmen as well. So, like, the beastmen aren't just made up of men who have devolved. There are also animals who have evolved into beastmen. But to my knowledge about beastmen, which is fairly extensive, no, there is no elven or dwarven creatures that have ever become beastmen. Because if you have to remember, the main source of corrupted men for beastmen are babies that are born as beastmen, or born with mutations, and the families just abandon them out in the forest. Dwarves and elves would never do that. If a baby was born mutated, they would almost certainly kill them. They would just put them down. I know of one dwarf story, which is, I believe, in the Dwarf Omnibus, Masters of Stone and Steel. I'm pretty sure it is. But there's a story about the dwarves and the elves trying to, like, rekindle an alliance, way after the War of Vengeance, but before the Rise of Man. And there is a dwarf in that story who was born mutated, but the dwarves didn't just abandon him in the forest. They locked him, like, in a cage. Or they locked him in a room, like, hidden really, really well. But, yeah, no. As for mutated greenskins, they do exist. There are tons of greenskins that have been mutated by chaos. But it's rare that a greenskin will be mutated unless they, like, directly come into contact with, like, warpstone, or they're burned by the warping fires of Tzeentch or something like that. That being said, when greenskins do mutate, they are usually very quickly and brutally murdered by others of their kind, because whenever someone mutates, very rarely do mutations benefit the person who is mutated. Most of the times they just mess you up or, like, hurt you in a way or hinder you. And in greenskin culture, if you have anything that makes you even remotely weak or stand out, your brethren will murder the crap out of you. Goblins are cruel and vindictive little creatures that will just stab you in the back given the first chance, or torture you. And orcs would just take it as something to just beat the crap out of, to prove that they're big and strong, or they're dead hard. So, yeah, no, mutations tend not to go well for greenskins. You're usually going to get killed by your fellows because it just paints a target on your back. Um, and Khorne and greenskins have an interesting relationship in that Khorne does vaguely like greenskins because they are violent, but greenskins never worship any of the dark gods, because to greenskins the only gods worth worshipping and the only gods they care for are Gork and Mork, who of course have some similarities to Khorne in that they're constantly fighting, but greenskins do not kill for the sake of killing. Greenskins like to fight for fun, which Khorne is kind of alien to. Khorne is all about the spilling of blood and murder to a maddening degree. You know, Khorne would be furious if his warriors went into a city and left anybody alive. Like, all blood should be shed because all blood belongs to Khorne. There have been many instances where some instances where orcs in particular, you know, Khorne wouldn't like goblins, but there are plenty of orcs who have like gotten to a settlement or a camp or something, and like they fight like the warriors in a battle, and then all that's left are you know, the women and children and stuff, and the orcs will just leave them or like not pursue them, or even just there was even a siege where basically all the defenders sallied out to fight the greenskins and they got slaughtered, and the greenskins like smashed the gate in. It was orcs, and the war boss looked in and was like, like all the people were like cowering and terrified, and he was like, this is no fun, like this sucks, let's go fight this other city, and they just left. Like they just pieced out. Orcs will do that. Orcs don't kill for the sake of killing. They fight because they think a hard battle is just super fun, and but there is kind of a purpose to it. And although I do think greenskins and Khornates like each other a lot, you know, greenskins think they're just like some of the best people to fight, and Khornates exult in the hard insanity, in like all the blood spilling that greenskins will cause. Orcs do not give a shit for Khorne. They don't respect him. They don't care for him. He's you have to remember that to orcs, they prize Gork and Mork above all else. They like the gods that are brutally cunning and cunningly brutal. And Khorne's just a little too one-dimensional, I think, for their tastes. I should note, as an aside, the only intelligent, vaguely at least, intelligent race that suffers a lot from mutations but embraces it as like a good thing are ogres. Ogres are very, very fond of mutations, especially if they are lucky enough to be blessed with like extra mouths, like mouths on their arms or stomach or legs or back or whatever, like, or like two heads or something. Like, to ogres, ogres love mutations, and chaos ogres are the only chaos breed of their species that can like go home and be welcomed as a hero. Like, ogres prefer worshiping the Great Maw, and they don't like chaos warriors, but they love when ogre warriors come home, or chaos ogres come home, and the chaos ogre like shares stories of their adventures and like shows off all their crazy tentacles and extra mouths and mutations and stuff, and ogres just think that's like, they just think that's awesome. so there are some overlaps in ogre culture, but not greenskin culture. Chosen of Cain asks, why did the Dawi not invent more rather than using old designs? Okay, so we've talked about this a lot, but just to go over it again, the Dawi believe that tradition is best, and that everything their ancestors did was flawless, which in many cases in their defense is true. When it comes to stonework, runecraft, architecture, a lot of things like that, etc., the dwarves are constantly struggling just to retain the skill possessed by their ancestors. All of their greatest works were in the past, and every innovation in dwarven culture risks losing or corrupting the values of their ancestors. Because like the construction of Karazakarak, or its walls or its gates, the dwarves can't do that anymore. They don't have like the skill to do it because a lot of those skills have been lost over time due to people dying. Because I will say, if there's one really bad habit among Dawi, is that dwarves are very, very protective of their knowledge. Like runesmiths are notorious for this. They will not pass down their knowledge. They are so bad about it. They guard their knowledge like it is, like if they tell you what they know, they'll just instantly die and go to hell. So the dwarves hold on to knowledge because they refuse to pass it on to anyone that they do not deem as like perfectly deserving. So unfortunately, that has led to many, many dwarves dying before they got the chance to pass on their knowledge, especially among rune lords. Engineering, though, is the only field in which the dwarves actively benefit from innovation. Runecrafting sometimes does, but generally most rune lore is spent trying to figure out, like, find the really, really powerful runes and bring them back, as opposed to creating your own. But the problem is that engineering, which is where dwarves, which I think everyone that's human would agree, dwarves benefit heavily from when they innovate in engineering. Unfortunately, the mindset and lifestyle of the dwarves has deeply infected every aspect of their culture. And this has led to them viewing all forms of innovation as reckless and dangerous. It takes at least a century of proven effectiveness and flawless design for dwarves to even consider updating their weaponry. And even then, many, many, many dwarves refuse to get on board. The hold of Katakirn, for instance, which is the main hold of the Black Mountains, and is ruled by Alric Ranulfson, King Alric Ranulfson. They despise what they call newfangled innovations like black powder weapons. So these guys hate thunderers, they hate cannons, they hate organ guns. Don't even get them started on alchemical weapons like flame cannons. Because their ancestors got along fine using crossbows and stone throwers. So why should they need to use anything any advanced? Longbeards tend to heavily focus on the ideology that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And many dwarves think, honestly, that if you update something, you are spitting on your ancestor, because you are saying that, no, you're saying my ancestor's design wasn't good enough. I'm better. I can make it better. I can improve it. And to dwarves, that's like, how dare you shame your ancestor like that? So that's why they don't innovate terribly much, and they're so resistant to it, which ultimately is actually what damned the dwarves in their struggles against the Skaven. When we got to the end times, which primarily were about the dwarves versus the Skaven, as far as all the matchups that were going on, the reason the dwarves lost that war in the end was because they refused to innovate fast enough. The end times was basically that the Skaven finally reached the breaking point where their innovations and technological achievements and monster breeding and yada yada reached the point where it overwhelmed the advantages the dwarves had developed on them already. And the Skaven got to the point where they could overwhelm the true masterworks of the dwarves that had held the Skaven at bay for 10,000 plus years or whatever. Skaven haven't been around that long, but you get the point. Zach B. Sane asks, have any dwarves ever ridden horses, demigryphs, hippogriffs, manticores, dragons, or anything of the sort? Also, would gyrocopter/gyrobomber master engineers be lore accurate? So, the only people capable of even piloting gyrocopters or gyrobombers are engineers. So, yes, a master engineer having a gyrobomber or a gyrocopter mount in Total War Warhammer, totally lore accurate. I really think they should put that in the game. It would make engineers a lot more interesting. Especially in multiplayer, you would actually take them. Have any dwarves ever willingly rode on a monster? No. No. So much no. There has never been a dwarf who has willingly rode on a horse or anything of the sort. Best case scenario, they have like a pony pulling a wagon. There have been desperate situations that have led to dwarves like riding something, but no dwarf has willingly taken that step. There's actually a really funny moment where in the War of Vengeance trilogy, where two dwarves were offered to ride on a dragon, and they were actually going to say yes, but then a shenanigan happens and something happens where they get insulted and they're like, screw this dragon. But it's not the dragon's fault. It was due to something else. But that's like the closest that ever happened. Which I will say, if dwarves had gotten friendly enough with dragons to ride them, they would have been unstoppable. Anyway, Johan asks, what do dwarves think of the Dark Elves, and do any other dwarves except for Grombrindal know that Malekith is responsible for the War of Vengeance? So, the dwarves are aware of the betrayal of Malekith and the Dark Elves. But to them, it doesn't matter. The thing with the dwarves is by the end of the War of Vengeance, the dwarves had learned that the Dark Elves existed, and they learned that Malekith had betrayed them, and he had set them up to fight the elves. They understood that. But dwarves have really serious honor codes and pride issues, and to them, that doesn't matter. Just because Malekith manipulated them into fighting each other doesn't suddenly mean that everything the High Elves did isn't their fault, and they shouldn't be held responsible for it. The dwarves hold all elves as a species responsible for the War of Vengeance. And while the Dark Elves supposedly, in some dwarves' opinions, started it, it was ultimately the High Elves who fought it. A ton of atrocities were committed by both sides in that war. That war got ugly. That being said, the dwarves hate Malekith, and if given the chance would kill him in a heartbeat, but dwarves don't like any elves. They consider all elves to be rotten. There are some dwarves who don't hate the elves as much because, you have to remember that the High Elves' grudges were all considered stricken out by High King Gotrek Starbreaker after he slew Kalidor II, who was the Phoenix King at the time, and took the Phoenix crown, and he was like, all right, we're even now. So the dwarves do not kill any high elf on sight. No. Just like they wouldn't kill a wood elf on sight. A dark elf, a dwarf would totally kill on sight if he recognized them, because dwarves recognize that while the wood elves and high elves have attempted friendly relations or attempted to be allies or not aggressive, the dark elves are total dicks. And the dwarves do recognize that, but they don't like any of the elves. Johan again asked, do dwarves have pets? This actually says pats, but I assume you mean pets. And if so, what animals do they adopt? So dwarves don't really care much for animals. They don't trust them. Dwarves consider animals to be too unpredictable and unreliable. So they very rarely have pets. We're humans where we make bonds with pets and we kind of love them for their unpredictability. Cat owners. Generally, cat owners are people who are held hostage by cats, but are entertained by that notion. And to a dwarf, that a cat would get killed so quick by dwarves. The instant the cat did some douchey thing that cats are super famous for. If a dwarf lived in a house and he took on a cat as a pet, and it did that thing where it sits on the counter and just started pushing crap off and breaking glasses, or it hissed at the dwarf because he walked by too noisily or something, that cat would be dead. And dwarves wouldn't even like dogs. Dogs would be barking loudly, or if something happened, the dog got scared and ran away or made a mistake. Dwarves do not forgive mistakes. You have to remember that. They're very, very not okay with that. And animals are just too unpredictable for dwarves to like them that much. I will say though, there have been dwarf rangers and farmers who have formed bonds with some animals. And there are even myths about a dwarf who had a friend who was a bear. Like there was a dwarf who had a super intense, like almost brother in arms that was a bear. But to say that these relationships are rare is a big understatement. The only dwarves who would even consider having pets are dwarves who have like gone out in the world and explored and been in the wilds, so like rangers and stuff. But you have to remember, in dwarf culture, you're considered kind of an oofty if you wander around too much. You're supposed to stay at home in your hold and do stuff. Stay with your clan and your family and mine or whatever it is you do. Kroll Papalurgy, I want to say Lurgy because it's easier to say, but Luggy, whatever. Do dwarves think better of humans who have beards than those who do not? Yes, if you have a beard, dwarves are more likely to like you. Johan, welcome back. What is the most powerful / amazing invention of the Engineers Guild? Of the actual engineering guild, easily the Thunder Barge. So the Thunder Barge is the mightiest, the mightiest of the Thunder Barges is known as the Wrath of Thunder, which was created by the Zufbar engineer Sven Hasselfrapp. The Wrath of Thunder is a ludicrous airship that has a crew of 10 dwarves, and it has, well, the firing crew is 10 dwarves. It has 5 organ guns. 5 organ guns angled around it that can rotate and fire. And it has racks of these super large bombs called Thunder Bombs. So it's a gyro bomber on steroids that flies at a much higher altitude, and it has 5 freaking fully functioning organ guns on it, which is madness. Because you have to remember, in tabletop, they tended to scale things down a little bit. So like in Total War Warhammer, when you take a organ gun in your army, you actually get 3 organ guns. You get a battery, essentially, of organ guns. In tabletop, you got 1 organ gun. So a Thunder Barge had 5 freaking things on it. I would almost expect, I really hope Total War gives us like Zeppelins or Thunder Barges or whatever you want to call them. Really, really hope we get airships at some point. Tonome asks, assuming non-end times, has a grudge ever been ignored or forgiven for the sake of the greater good? And if so, what was the largest one that was? Not very rarely. There have, so not including the end times, because there was, of course, a really famous instance at the end times of that happening. Not including the end times, there have been scenarios where essentially a grudge would be struck out for like a greater good reason. Yes, like a king has the authority to strike out a grudge if it's considered settled due to something unusual. Like maybe a grudge was made against a particular clan, and then something like Belagar, for instance, there were a ton of grudges against clans who abandoned Carrick 8 Peaks before its fall, like way before its fall. There are a lot of grudges against them for abandoning the hold, and typically those grudges are not forgivable, or at least are very, very difficult to have struck out. But Belagar was so desperate for reinforcements that when those different clans did start returning to Carrick 8 Peaks after Belagar took over, he struck a ton of them out. You can learn about that in Belagar's lore video. That being said, the only grudge I know of that was forgiven, like between the people involved, like the two decided to like set their differences aside and settle the grudge, is, so the only forgiven grudge I know of, I only know of one, and I don't want to spoil it, but if you want to read it, it's in the Gotrek and Felix adventure titled Orc Slayer. And bring Kleenex or like a box of tissues. You're gonna need them. It's a wonderful story, but it's really sad. Sha'un asks, what's the relation like with the opposing group after a grudge is settled? Depends on how it was settled. If both parties come to an understanding, or like the grudge that needed to be settled had like a really to the point, like so and so didn't use high enough quality wagons, so they have to pay a certain amount of oath gold and do this little thing, and the clan does it, then they'll resume relations with no issue whatsoever. Like, whatever, that's just business as usual. Now, if one side demands blood or they argue over how to settle it, then the resolution of that grudge can often lead to the declaration of another grudge. So, like, if, for instance, let's say that your clan was defending the flank leading up to a series of war machines owned by another clan, and your clan defending the flank got overwhelmed by greenskins and was killed, and because of that, the guys defending the war machines had to abandon them, and they lost their war machines. That the clan of engineers or that owned the war machine might say, we declare grudgement against the clan that failed to hold that flank because they screwed us by not holding. And the other clan's like, well, that's bullshit, but whatever. And then it leads to a scenario where that clan outright attacks them, or maybe they resolve it by like taxing them over heavily or do something to them. That clan will get pissed then and say, all right, well, we're going to declare a grudge against you guys because of what you just did, because that's bullshit. And it could literally go on for eternity. Or in many, many, many cases, what happens is like two clans will have a grudge, and the grudge will last for so long because like Orc Slayer, which I just talked about, there's a scenario in that book where there's two clans that have a grudge over a shield, and they've had the grudge for so long they don't remember, like, if I recall correctly, they don't remember the truth of it, or they don't remember, like, exactly how it started. They just know there's a grudge, and so they're, like, super angry about it. Typically, however, in Dwarven culture, the traditional and best way to settle a grudge is by having the lord or king in question handle deliberations, which, unfortunately, can still take just staggering amounts of time. Like, every time the dwarves go out on a march or an invasion or something, and you have to get, like, a lot of clans together, there's always time set aside before the fight starts for there to be a frickin' situation where they all stand around, and whoever's in charge of the the situation has to stand there and have all the clans come and air their grievances against each other, and he has to, like, try and settle it before they can even do anything. Oh, and we're past time, so that'll be it for this episode. See you guys for the next one.